Before the Fellowship was the greatest story you've never heard. I'm Cameron. Join us as we read and react to the Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien. Last time we read that Fingon, Fingolfin's son, who went to rescue Maedhros from Morgoth, succeeded, and to some degree the hosts of Fëanor and Fingolfin were reconciled. Today we continue chapter 13 of Quenta Silmarillion, beginning on page 111 of the second edition. Now King Thingol welcomed not with a full heart the coming of so many princes in might out of the west, eager for new realms. And he would not open his kingdom, nor remove its girdle of enchantment. For wise with the wisdom of Melian, he trusted not that the restraint of Morgoth would endure. Alone of the princes of the Noldor, those of Finarfin's house were suffered to pass within the confines of Doriath. For they could claim close kinship with King Thingol himself, since their mother was Eowyn of Alqualande, Olwë's daughter. Angrod, son of Finarfin, was the first of the exiles to come to Menegroth as messenger of his brother Finrod, and he spoke long with the king, telling him of the deeds of the Noldor in the north, and of their numbers, and of the ordering of their force. But being true and wise-hearted, and thinking all griefs now forgiven, he spoke no word concerning the kinslaying, nor of the manner of the exile of the Noldor and the oath of Fëanor. King Thingol hearkened to the words of Angrod, and ere he went he said to him, "Thus shall you speak for me to those that sent you. In Hithlum the Noldor have leave to dwell, and in the highlands of Dorthonion, and in the lands east of Doriath that are empty and wild. But elsewhere there are many of my people, and I would not have them restrained of their freedom, still less ousted from their homes. Beware, therefore, how you princes of the west bear yourselves, for I am the Lord of Beleriand. And all who seek to dwell there shall hear my word. Into Doriath none shall come to abide, but only such as I call guests, or who seek me in great need." Now the lords of the Noldor held council in Mithrim, and thither came Angrod out of Doriath, bearing the message of King Thingol. Cold seemed its welcome to the Noldor, and the sons of Fëanor were angered at his words. But Maedhros laughed, saying, "A king is he that can hold his own, or else his title is vain. Thingol does but grant us lands where his power does not run. Indeed, Doriath alone would be his realm this day, but for the coming of the Noldor. Therefore, in Doriath let him reign, and be glad that he has the sons of Finwë for his neighbors, not the Orcs of Morgoth that we found. Elsewhere it shall go as seems good to us." But Caranthir, who loved not the sons of Finarfin, and was the harshest of the brothers, and the most quick to anger, cried aloud, "Yea, more! Let not the sons of Finarfin run hither and thither with their tales to this dark elf in his caves. Who made them our spokesmen to deal with him? And though they be come indeed to Beleriand, let them not so swiftly forget that their father is a lord of the Noldor, though their mother be of other kin." Then Angrod was wrathful, and went forth from the council. Maedhros indeed rebuked Caranthir, but the greater part of the Noldor of both followings, hearing his words, were troubled in heart, fearing the fell spirit of the sons of Fëanor, that it seemed would ever be like to burst forth in rash word or violence. But Maedhros restrained his brothers, and they departed from the council. And soon afterwards they left Mithrim and went eastward beyond Eros to the wide lands about the hill of Himring. That region was named thereafter the March of Maedhros, for northwards there was little defense of hill or river against assault from Angband. There Maedhros his brothers kept watch. There Maedhros and his brothers kept watch, gathering all such people as would come to them, and they had few dealings with their kinsfolk westward, save at need. It is said indeed that Maedhros himself devised this plan to lessen the chances of strife, and because he was very willing that the chief peril of assault should fall upon himself. And he remained for his part in friendship with the houses of Fingolfin and Finarfin, and would come among them at times for common counsel. Yet he also was bound by the oath, though it slept now for a time. Now the people of Caranthir dwelt furthest east beyond the upper waters of Gelion, about Lake Helivorn, under Mount Rerir, and to the southward. And they climbed the heights of Ered Luin, and looked eastward in wonder, for wild and wide it seemed to them were the lands of Middle-earth. And thus it was that Caranthir's people came upon the dwarves, who after the onslaught of Morgoth and the coming of the Noldor had ceased their traffic into Beleriand. But though either people loved skill and were eager to learn, no great love was there between them. For the dwarves were secret and quick to resentment, and Caranthir was haughty, and scarce concealed his scorn for the unloveliness of the Naugrim, and his people followed their lord. Nevertheless, since both peoples feared and hated Morgoth, they made alliance, and had of it great profit, for the Naugrim learned many secrets of craft in those days, so that the smiths and masons of Nagrod and Belagost became renowned among their kin. And when the dwarves began again to journey into Beleriand, all the traffic of the dwarf mines passed first through the hands of Caranthir, and thus great riches came to him. When 20 years of the sun had passed, Fingolfin, king of the Noldor, made a great feast, and it was held in the spring near to the pools of Ivrin, whence the swift river Nerog arose. For there the lands were green and fair at the feet of the mountains of shadow that shielded them from the north. The joy of that feast was long remembered in later days of sorrow, and it was called Mereth Adurthad, the Feast of Reuniting. Thither came many of the chieftains and people of Fingolfin and Finrod, and of the sons of Fëanor, Maedhros and Maglor, with warriors of the eastern march. And there came also great numbers of the grey elves, wanderers of the woods of Beleriand and folks of the havens, with Círdan their lord. There came even green elves from Osiriand, the land of 7 rivers, far off under the walls of the Blue Mountains. But out of Doriath there came but 2 messengers, Mablung and Daeron, bearing greetings from the king. At Mereth Adurthad many counsels were taken in goodwill, and oaths were sworn of league and friendship. And it is told that at this feast the tongue of the grey elves was most spoken even by the Noldor, for they learned swiftly the speech of Beleriand, whereas the Sindar were slow to master the tongue of Valinor. The hearts of the Noldor were high and full of hope, and to many among them it seemed that the words of Fëanor had been justified, bidding them seek freedom and fair kingdoms in Middle-earth. And indeed there followed after long years of peace, while their swords fenced Beleriand from the ruin of Morgoth, and his power was shut behind gates. In those days there was joy beneath the new sun and moon, and all the land was glad. But still the shadow brooded in the north. And when again 30 years had passed, Turgon, son of Fingolfin, left Nevrast, where he dwelt, and sought out Finrod, his friend, upon the island of Tall Sirion, and they journeyed southward along the river, being weary for a while of the northern mountains. And as they journeyed, night came upon them beyond the mirrors of twilight, beside the waters of Sirion, and they slept upon his banks beneath the summer stars. But Ulmo, coming up the river, laid a deep sleep upon them and heavy dreams. and the trouble of the dreams remained after they awoke. But neither said aught to the other, for their memory was not clear, and each believed that Ulmo had sent a message to him alone. But unquiet was upon them ever after, and doubt of what should befall. And they wandered often alone in untrodden lands, seeking far and wide for places of hidden strength. For it seemed to each that he was bidden to prepare for a day of evil, and to establish a retreat, lest Morgoth should burst from Angband and overthrow the armies of the north. Now on a time, Finrod and Galadriel, his sister, were the guests of Thingol, their kinsman in Doriath. Then Finrod was filled with wonder at the strength and majesty of Menegroth, its treasuries and armories, and its many-pillared halls of stone. And it came into his heart that he would build wide halls behind ever-guarded gates in some deep and secret place beneath the hills. Therefore, he opened his heart to Thingol, telling him of his dreams. And Thingol spoke to him of the deep gorge of the river Narog, and the caves under the high Faroth in its steep western shore. And when he departed, he gave him guides to lead him to that place of which few yet knew. Thus Finrod came to the caverns of Narog, and began to establish there deep halls and armories after the fashion of the mansions of Menegroth. And that stronghold was called Norgothrond. In that labor, Finrod was aided by the dwarves of the Blue Mountains, and they were rewarded well. For Finrod had brought more treasuries out of Tirion than any other of the princes of the Noldor. And in that time was made for him the Nauglamir, the necklace of the dwarves, most renowned for their works in the elder days. It was a carcanet of gold, and set therein were gems uncounted from Valinor. But it had a power within it, so that it rested lightly on its wearer, as a strand of flax, and whatsoever neck it clasped, it sat always with grace and loveliness. There in Nargothrond, Finrod made his home with many of his people, and he was named in the tongue of the dwarves Felagund, hewer of caves. And that name he bore thereafter until his end. But Finrod Felagund was not the first to dwell in the caves beside the river Narog. Galadriel, his sister, went not with him to Nargothrond, for in Doriath dwelt Celeborn, kinsman of Thingol, and there was great love between them. Therefore she remained in the hidden kingdom, and abode with Melian, and of her great lore learned wisdom concerning Middle-earth. But Turgon remembered the city set upon a hill, Tirion the fair, with its tower and tree. And he found not what he sought, but returned to Nevrast, and sat in peace in Vinyamar, by the shores of the sea. And in the next year, Ulmo himself appeared to him, and bade him go forth again alone into the vale of Sirion. And Turgon went forth, and by the guidance of Ulmo he discovered the hidden vale of Tomb Laden in the encircling mountains, in the midst of which there was a hill of stone. Of this he spoke to none as yet, but returned once more to Nevrast, and there began in his secret councils to devise the plan of a city after the manner of Tirion upon Tuna, for which his heart yearned in exile. Now Morgoth, believing the report of his spies that the lords of the Noldor were wandering abroad with little thought of war, made trial of the strength and watchfulness of his enemies. Once more, with little warning, his might was stirred, and suddenly there were earthquakes in the north, and fire came from fissures in the earth, and the iron mountains vomited flame. And orcs poured forth across the plain of Ard-galen. Thence they thrust down the pass of Sirion into the west, and in the east they burst through the land of Maglor, in the gap between the hills of Maedhros and the outliers of the Blue Mountains. But Fingolfin and Maedhros were not sleeping, and while others sought out the scattered bands of orcs that strayed in Beleriand and did great evil, they came upon the main host from either side as it was assaulting Dorthonion. And they defeated the servants of Morgoth, and pursuing them across Ard-galen, destroyed them utterly, to the least and last, within sight of Angband's gates. That was the third great battle of the Wars of Beleriand, and it was named Dagor Aglareb, the Glorious Battle. A victory it was, and yet a warning. And the princes took heed of it, and thereafter drew closer their leaguer, and strengthened and ordered their watch, setting the siege of Angband, which lasted well nigh 400 years of the sun. For a long time after Dagor Aglareb, no servant of Morgoth would venture from his gates, for they feared the lords of the Noldor. And Fingolfin boasted that save by treason among themselves, Morgoth could never again burst from the leaguer of the Eldar, nor come upon them at unawares. Yet the Noldor could not capture Angband, nor could they regain the Silmarils, and war never wholly ceased in that time of the siege. For Morgoth devised new evils, and ever and anon he would make trial of his enemies. Nor could the stronghold of Morgoth be ever wholly encircled, for the Iron Mountains, from whose great curving wall the towers of Thangorodrim were thrust forward, defended it upon either side, and were impassable to the Noldor, because of their snow and ice. Thus in his rear and to the north, Morgoth had no foes, and by that way his spies at times went out and came by devious routes into Beleriand. And desiring above all to sow fear and disunion among the Eldar, he commanded the Orcs to take alive any of them that they could and bring them bound to Angband. And some he so daunted by the terror of his eyes that they needed no chains more, but walked ever in fear of him, doing his will wherever they might be. Thus Morgoth learned much of all that had befallen since the rebellion of Fëanor, and he rejoiced, seeing therein the seed of many dissensions among his foes. When nearly 100 years had run since the Dagor Aglareb, Morgoth endeavored to take Fingolfin at unawares, for he knew of the vigilance of Maedhros. And he sent forth an army into the White North, and they turned west and again south, and came down the coasts to the Firth of Drengest, by the route that Fingolfin followed from the grinding ice. Thus they would enter into the realm of Hithlum from the west. But they were espied in time, and Fingon fell upon them among the hills at the head of the Firth, and most of the Orcs were driven into the sea. This was not reckoned among the great battles, for the Orcs were not great in number, and only a part of the people of Hithlum fought there. But thereafter there was peace for many years, and no open assault from Angband. For Morgoth perceived now that the Orcs unaided were no match for the Noldor, and he sought in his heart for new counsel. Again, after 100 years, Glaurung, the first of the Uraloki, the fire drakes of the north, issued from Angband's gates by night. He was yet young and scarce half-grown, for long and slow is the life of the dragons. But the elves fled before him to Ered-Wethrin and Dorthonion in dismay, and he defiled the fields of Ard-galen. Then Fingon, prince of Hithlum, rode against him with archers on horseback, and hemmed him around with a ring of swift riders, and Glaurung could not endure their darts, being not yet come to his full armory. And he fled back to Angband, and came not forth again for many years. Fingon won great praise, and the Noldor rejoiced, for few foresaw the full meaning and threat of this new thing. But Morgoth was ill pleased that Glaurung had disclosed himself oversoon. And after his defeat there was the long peace of well nigh 200 years. In all that time there were but affrays on the marches, and all Beleriand prospered and grew rich. Behind the guard of their armies in the north, the Noldor built their dwellings and their towers, and many fair things they made in those days, and poems and histories and books of lore. In many parts of the land, the Noldor and the Sindar became welded into one people, and spoke the same tongue. Though this difference remained between them, that the Noldor had the greater power of mind and body, and were the mightier warriors and sages, and they built with stone, and loved the hill slopes and open lands. But the Sindar had the fairer voices, and were more skilled in music, save only Maglor, son of Fëanor. And they loved the woods and the riversides, and some of the gray elves still wandered far and wide without settled abode, and they sang as they went. So in summary, Thingol informs the Noldor that they are not to make dwellings in his kingdom, Doriath, and claims kinship over all Beleriand. The sons of Fëanor, being the sons of Fëanor, balk at this and are dismissive of Thingol, and they begin to spread eastward through Beleriand. Ulmo appears to Turgon and Finrod in dreams and urges them to prepare against assault from Morgoth. They begin work on establishing hidden fortresses. Finrod establishes Nargothrond in the river Nerog, and Turgon establishes a fortress in the Vale of Sirion. Morgoth, seeking to test the strength of the Noldor, sends his armies southward, both to the pass of Sirion in the west and through the land of Maglor and Maedhros to the east. The Noldor utterly defeat Morgoth's forces in Dagor Agloreb, the glorious battle. Morgoth continues to prod and probe, seeking weaknesses in the Noldor and Sindar. Fingon, Fingolfin's son, drives back Glaurung, the first fire drake, also known as dragon. The elves are unable to take Angband for the Silmarils, but Morgoth is unable to best the elves. They thrive in an age of relative peace. Cool. If you like what you hear, go ahead and rate us 3 Silmarils out of 3. Follow us everywhere at Before the Fellowship. And check out our Discord channel. Link is in the description. And if you have any comments or questions, send them to beforethefellowship@gmail.com. Join us next week as we read the greatest story you've never heard, The Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien.